Any college professor who's teaching principles of macroeconomics would have put the money market graph to rest years ago. The last time that the Federal Reserve targeted the money supply occurred between October 1979 and October 1982. The first paper that really came out on the difference between the money market, limited reserves, and ample reserves was Jane Eric, senior economist at the Federal Reserve, along with some of her colleagues, when she wrote about the Federal Reserve's new approach to raising interest rates. Do you notice on the graph to the left, which we're going to stay focused on today, on the y-axis, the term primary credit rate? Now, just so you know, and you'll learn throughout the lessons that I'll give, the primary credit rate took the place of the discount rate back in 2003. And because she put before the financial crisis, the only way she could have put primary credit rate in there is she is thinking of a period of time starting in January of 2003. Then Scott Walla from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis wrote in his paper in 2019, A New Frontier Monetary Policy with Ample Reserves. And he also divided it up into two graphs, one with limited reserves and the other with ample reserves, with limited reserves included on that graph. But again, we're going to stay focused on the graph to the left. And do you notice that he wrote that instead of the primary credit rate, he has the discount rate and the federal funds rate. But up at the top, the graph is labeled federal funds rate, but includes an administered rate, the discount rate. So then Jane Eric and Scott Walla got together and wrote a lesson called Closing the Monetary Policy Curriculum Gap, a primer for educators making the transition to teaching the Fed's ample reserves framework. But again, we're going to keep focused on this limited reserves framework to begin with. And you notice that there is no heading for the y-axis and the discount rate is used. But if you look at the two graphs, they tried to make a comparison of the federal funds rate and what happens in a limited reserves framework as compared to an ample reserves framework. Again, we're going to stay focused on the limited reserves framework off to the left. From this point forward, any college professor with his or her weight in gold wouldn't be teaching the money market today when there's so much to learn with the limited reserves framework and that graph and the ample reserves framework and that graph. So we're going to move away from this money market graph and focus on the first writings by Jane Eric in 2016. Now, do you notice here, just so you know, a lot of things that you taught about the money market graph apply to the limited reserves framework graph on the right. For instance, you should still teach about required reserves. You should still teach about the discount rate, which is now considered to be the primary credit rate here in the US. You should definitely teach about open market operations because that shifts the supply curve both in the limited reserves framework on the graph here to the right, plus it also shifts the supply of available reserves in the ample reserves framework graph. All the tools that were used when you taught about the money market are also used when you're talking about the limited reserves graph. The major difference that you can see is the demand for money is generally less steep compared to the demand for the limited reserves framework because the demand for money is influenced by a broader range of factors, including such things as transactionary demand for money, precautionary demand for money, where the demand for limited reserves on the right is primarily driven by the need, quote unquote, for banks to meet reserve requirements and settle payments. So from now on, just stay focused on the limited reserves framework. Now, going back to the money market graph, this occurred from 1979 to 1982. In October 1979, Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided to use unconventional monetary policy and began focusing on M2 monetary aggregates as a key indicator for monetary policy. He announced that the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, would start targeting the quantity of money, which included M2. This shift aimed to control inflation by influencing the money supply. So if you look at the graph to the right, what he was trying to do, if you notice, most of the time, was decrease the money supply and try to drive up those interest rates, those short-term nominal interest rates, because he was not only concerned about inflation, but he was also very, very concerned about expected inflation, and he wanted to stop that at all costs. In fact, this was called the Volcker shock. By late 1982, the Fed, in response to financial market innovations and declining inflation, shifted back to targeting the price of bank reserves. In other words, interest rates for reserves. Do you notice that the federal funds rate in purple is higher than the discount rate? And yet the discount rate is used for lenders of last resort. The Fed, in a deliberate move, allowed federal funds rate to rise as part of its efforts to control inflation and maintain price stability. This meant that banks were lending to each other at higher rates, which then translated into higher borrowing costs for consumers and businesses. Higher interest rates helped to curb economic demand and reduce inflationary pressures in the short run. However, they also made borrowing more expensive for businesses and consumers. So you're not used to seeing that the discount rate was lower than the federal funds rate. The Federal Reserve is a lender of last resort. Why wouldn't commercial banks then go to the Federal Reserve and borrow at a lower interest rate at the discount rate shown in black compared to the federal funds rate, where banks would lend money to each other overnight? Well, there was another tool, sort of an unwritten tool of monetary policy, called moral suasion. Moral suasion meant that the Federal Reserve, if you went and borrowed from them at a lower rate rather than going to other banks, they got concerned about your books at your commercial bank. And so the one thing that banks didn't want to happen is the Federal Reserve to start looking over the bank books. This was the last time the money supply was used in monetary policy. Let's see how this occurs. Now, my demand curve for reserves isn't quite as steep as it should be just because I'm not a professional programmer, but let's just go through what this looked like on the graph. Do you notice here that the federal funds rate was 600 basis points above the discount rate? So let me just show you it on the graph to the left. Federal funds rate through open market operations, 19%, and the discount rate was 13%. As you can see, there was a 600 basis point difference between the two, and the federal funds rate lied above the discount rate, which is very unusual. You who've taught economics, as the discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges member banks for borrowing money, and the only way that member banks should come to the Federal Reserve is the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort. You can stop the video and you can see the inflation rates down below the Fred graph above, and what Volcker did with working the money supply is to stop not only inflation, but he wanted to slow expected inflation rates. Targeting the supply of money ended towards the end of 1982. It is unfathomable that college-level macroeconomics textbooks today still use the money market graph to describe monetary policy that had ended over 40 years ago. To my knowledge of teaching macroeconomics, it is the longest standing misinformation that textbooks today still describe as the truth.